You can tell I haven't been to work in a week. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Talking Data Equity for Friday, October 27th. And I am Heather Kraus, part of We All Count, the project for equity in all things data. And I am so excited to welcome you to Talking Data Equity today, which is an informal gathering of anyone who is interested in actually embedding data in embedding equity in their data work. In other words, people who are interested in breaking through this myth that quantitative data is value neutral and aligning the choices that they make in their data projects with the values that they're actually trying to center in those projects. And Talking Data Equity is an informal gathering designed to help give you practical advice, concrete examples, and remind you that you are not alone, because it can feel that way some days. This week, we have an incredibly exciting special guest that was suggested by many of you. And I thought we'd have a really hard time because they are in the UK. And so it is Friday night for our special guest, Kevin Guyan. But they still agreed to come today and be with us. So I'm going to introduce you to Kevin. I know many of you have already read his work and are excited. But for those of you who are just getting to know Kevin, he is the author of a book called Queer Data. Now, I should have practiced saying the name of the Scottish town where you live, Edinburgh, right? Is that right, Kevin? Edinburgh, okay. He is an Edinburgh-based writer and researcher whose work explores the intersection of data and identity, particularly as it relates to LGBTQ lives and experiences. He's the author of Queer Data, which examines the collection, analysis, and use of gender, sex, and sexuality data in the UK. Kevin works as a research fellow at the University of Glasgow and is a member of the Royal Society of Edinburgh's Young Academy of Scotland and sits on the board of the LGBTQ charity, the Equality Network. And when I was getting ready to introduce Kevin and his work to you today, especially the book, I started pulling out quotes, and I pulled out so many quotes that it would take the whole hour. So I'm just going to highly, highly recommend that you get your hands on a copy of this book. You can buy it. Most libraries have it, at least actually get it in the United States before it's banned. But in Canada and in the UK, it's not banned. And I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to turn it over to Kevin, but let me give you a second of housekeeping to tell you what this is going to look like. As usual, we're doing this as a Zoom meeting, even though there's hundreds of you. And so we need a little bit of organization, which means that we're going to ask that you stay on mute while Kevin is sharing some slides, sharing a little bit of their stories and their experiences. You can feel free to use the Zoom chat as much as you want. And then when Kevin's done sharing slides and stories, we're going to give you an opportunity to raise your hand and we'll unmute you one at a time. Okay, so thank you for your patience, and let me turn it over to Kevin. And Kevin, I cannot say enough how happy we are that you're spending your Friday night with us.
No, thank you. Thank you so much, Heather, for the invite to join you all today. A perfect way to end my week. So I'm going to kind of kick things off by speaking for about 10 minutes about very broadly, what do I mean by queer data, some of the themes I kind of untease in the book, and then kind of really keen to hear from you all about your work and your practice and kind of how you maybe engage with some of those themes. So let's see if I can share my screen. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see a nice slide, but no speaking notes. Perfect, perfect. Okay, so I've kind of maybe controversially titled this like introduction to queer data around the kind of dangers of inclusion. And it's meant to be a little bit provocative, and you'll see maybe what I mean by that when we're speaking around inclusion and how that kind of intersects with data practices. So what I'm kind of going to speak about and look and kind of think about today is what happens at the intersections where queer lives, so very broadly, people who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, or some other kind of minoritized gender community, what happens when these lives meet the data practices of institutions, of government agencies, and of other organizations. In these kind of intersections, who benefits and who loses, and how might collecting more and more data about queer lives sometimes push the ideals of justice and liberation further into the distance? Now, nobody wants to be the kind of killjoy at the party, but I'm going to argue in my little introduction today that when we talk about inclusive approaches to data, we need to consider both the good and the bad. In the UK, across many different industries and sectors, the main problem we face for LGBTQ communities is not a lack of data. So whether it's housing or healthcare, education or equality, more and more quantitative and qualitative data exists about the different experiences of queer communities. It's therefore vital that we don't waste time, energy, and resources gathering more and more proof of the problem, when sometimes what we really need is action. Now, if anybody's had a chance to read any of my writing or some sections of the book, you'll know that I am a bit of a geek for the census. And I'm very lucky to be based in Edinburgh, in Scotland, where we've had a lot of really exciting developments around the capture of LGBTQ data in the census. So across the UK in 2021 and 2022, the National Census had 2 new questions. So one question on sexual orientation and one new question on transgender identity. So this is a little sneak peek of what those questions were in Scotland. Somewhat confusingly, the questions did differ across the different parts of the UK, but these are the Scottish questions. Now, this data has many positives, and it does help researchers and policymakers create a national picture of the UK's LGBTQ population. It also, and I think this is really important, challenges historical design faults with the census. There's been a census in the UK for well over 200 years, and for too long, it presumed that everyone is cisgender and straight. And for some LGBTQ people, being counted in a census does mark a pinnacle of queer inclusion and recognition by the state. But as I do in my work, and as I hope we can kind of untease in our discussion today, when we start to scratch the surface in something like a census, we see that this inclusive exercise is not as inclusive as it might perhaps first seem. So while the census in England, Scotland, and Wales did have new questions on sexual orientation and whether or not somebody identified as trans, the data collection exercise continued to require all respondents to identify their sex as either male or female. For non-binary people who may not identify in this way, selecting a binary sex option was compulsory, with non-completion risking a fine of up to £1,000. So I kind of wanted to share this little example to show that while some queer people are now counted in the census, the design of data collection tools continues to push and kind of push particular characteristics or ways of thinking about identity further out of the picture. So this kind of begs the question, who counts within the wider queer community? And this is a kind of a sticky question that sits at the heart of my work on queer data. So in my book, I build upon the fantastic work of scholars, practitioners, activists, working in the broad field of queer data, and describe this concept as consisting of 2 distinct strands. So on one hand, queer data means the data about LGBTQ communities, with a particular focus in my work on quantitative data. And the second strand is a bit broader, a bit bigger, and this is kind of asking questions about or querying the methods used to collect, analyze, and present all types of data. Now, you'll likely be more familiar with this first strand, the kind of locating of data about LGBTQ communities. Now, this historical data was sparse, but as I mentioned, its scope, availability, and detail are increasing. What I want to kind of focus on today is the second strand of queer data. And for me, this is a little bit more kind of the more interesting strand, as this both complements and challenges kind of ideas we have around how we collect, analyze, and present all types of data. This second strand asks us all to ask questions about the methods we use in our data projects. It moves the focus from the subjects of our investigation, so in my work, LGBTQ communities, to instead kind of force us to ask questions about the politics, the history, and the power of the practitioners, the researchers, the policymakers who lie behind these studies. This second strand of queer data does not presuppose the need for more or better data about LGBTQ lives. In fact, in some instances, it highlights how efforts to accumulate more and more data can actually inflict harm upon the communities under investigation and move us further away from addressing injustice, discrimination, and exclusion. So my work kind of in academia and kind of more broadly LGBTQ equality work has kind of brought me into many different parts of the broad diversity, equality, and inclusion sector in the UK, and Europe, and the US. And I'm going to let you in on a secret here. Not all diversity interventions are effective, nor do all projects, initiatives, and programs around diversity, equality, and inclusion actually help the communities they claim to support. So we need to ask kind of awkward questions here about our motives, our intentions, and whether in our data projects, we are the best people placed to take action. As I mentioned earlier, in the context of the UK in 2023, we're not existing in a time and place where all queers are not counted, or where explicit discrimination in data is our main focus. Think back to the census. Some queer people are now counted, but this inclusion in data exposes some of the limits of visibility and the limits of recognition, and how being counted is sometimes an important step on a bigger journey, but on its own is simply not enough. So kind of against this contemporary backdrop, I want you to think, what is the role of data? I'm sure many in the call today will have heard the demand that we need more data. There'll be a problem, there'll be something worth investigating, and there'll be kind of this demand that we'll go out and collect more data. And quantitative and qualitative data can sometimes play a really key role in kind of engaging people in positions of power and creating spaces that are inclusive and equal. But you might have guessed from my kind of tone so far that I don't believe the accumulation of more and more data is the answer to all of our problems. I want to share a quote from an amazing scholar doing work around data justice in the US, the sociologist Ruha Benjamin, who in her work around racial justice argues that the problem is not a lack of knowledge, and that demanding data on subjects we already know much about is actually a perversion of knowledge. Benjamin's work argues that minoritized communities are invited to accumulate yet more data about injustice, burning through finite resources to provide further proof of the problem. But I want you to think, what if this time, this money, this energy, this labor were used in other ways? What if we spend this energy on the development of mental health services, the provision of community-level legal support, or monetary help with overdue bills or outstanding rent payments? In my work, I try to think through the kind of material costs of the work we do with data, the time, the energy, the money, and thinking through how that is best spent. And sometimes collecting data isn't the best solution. I also want to kind of highlight how we see this play out in intersectional analysis and the work of legal scholar and all-around icon Kimberly Crenshaw, who's helped popularize the concept of intersectionality by demonstrating how ideas of race and gender play out in civil rights cases in the US. So in Crenshaw's analysis, there's a really interesting kind of data strand running through some of her work. And she argues that in discrimination claims brought to court by a Black woman, they were sometimes told that the data was inadmissible because of the small numbers of people in the sample. So they were told to go off, to expand the sample size so that it included either all Black people or all women. But by expanding the coverage of the data, this could transform the data in ways that weakened its original meaning, as the dataset now included the least marginalized among women and the least marginalized among Black people. So my kind of concluding point here is that rather than a force to produce something new, whether good or bad, data can sometimes operate as a jam in the system that perpetuates the status quo and protects current ways of working. The design of data practices, whether it's surveys, focus groups, interviews, any type of data collection tool, they don't arrive with us as some sort of apolitical or ahistorical artifact. They don't collect information about the outside world that's simply static, fixed, and out there waiting to be uncovered. Rather, the tools and methods and the practices we use in our work, they are crafted, tweaked, and changed to serve the particular interests of individuals, organizations, or ways of thinking. I don't yet know the solution to all of these big challenges I've posed, but I hope that in conversations like the one we're having today, and thinking through that intersection of data and identity, I hope that'll spark wider questions about how we go about producing knowledge and changing the world for the better. So I'm going to pause there. Heather, I know you mentioned if anybody wanted to grab a copy of the book, I'm happy to share the slides afterwards. There's a wee discount code on the screen if anybody wanted to get a copy, hasn't got a copy, I'm happy to share that. I think it should work in the US and Canada, and if not, I'm a big fan of libraries, so please check out your local library and see if there's a copy in stock. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Kevin, thank you so much. And bringing a discount code for your book is an unexpected generosity. So we will definitely be sharing those slides. Again, we'll put the slides as always up in the Talking Data Equity section of the community forum. So, and I cannot say enough about this book. It's really one of the best books that I have read recently. Amazing, mind-blowing. And if you are in the United States, you should check it out at the library, even if you already own a copy, because then your library will get statistics that show that people are checking this book out and they want it. Okay, so as promised, we're going to give you folks time to talk. And I also have a number of different questions. But before I start, I'm going to see if there's anybody in the room that wants to raise their hand and ask to be unmuted. Again, there's a lot of you, so we'll just go in turn. One of the things that I'm going to ask while you folks think about whether you want to unmute is I first of all love the idea of we need more data can be something that an anti-equity movement in equity clothes, and one of the places that I find that to be really true is data about individuals. When they say we need data, and along with the scholars that you referenced, there's so much of an idea that we need data about the individual characteristics of people, and I very much agree with Dr. Benjamin and Dr. Crenshaw that we already know that there's plenty of marginalization. And then people say, well, we need to measure progress. Well, we know that homophobia is here or whatever the marginalization or oppression that we're talking about, but how are we going to know if an institution's getting better? And what I say to that is, well, if we want to see if an institution's getting better, we need more data about how that institution is doing. So go ahead and measure what that institution is doing, but you don't have to collect more data from the people that are being marginalized. And then I get the response of, but how? So I'm wondering if you are working with, in your attempt to find different solutions to this, we need more data. Have you found other responses that have been effective in talking to people who really do want to maybe delay change with this idea?
Thank you. A really good question. I think it's quite a lot of my work over the past 5 years has been in kind of data, quality data, diversity data in higher education institutions. So working with kind of university
Yep.
teams who, as you maybe mentioned, are trying to prove or disprove whether a problem is getting better or worse. And what always frustrated me was kind of the collect data, the kind of more data response was the easy answer often. So it's really challenging to address structural racism, homophobia, transphobia within your institution. It's a lot easier to go out and collect data about it rather than getting to the source of the problem. In terms of kind of shifting the mindset around that, I hope that my work can kind of expose some of the harms for the communities who are, as you're mentioning, kind of over-researched, over-analysed, over-investigated. And I think those harms manifest in a few different ways. So I mentioned in my kind of introduction, there's this kind of the labour of the communities, so the actual time you're expecting from them to be completing surveys, engaging in research exercises.
Yeah.
But also there's an element to it where the data we collect about the communities is presenting a very one-sided view of lives and experiences that are extremely rich and diverse and colourful and broad. And actually, when all the data we have around the LGBTQ communities is around harm, harassment, bullying, poor outcomes, this kind of negative data set, I think, can actually be quite problematic in terms of what data exists out there. So trying to kind of, I guess, shift how senior managers, leaders, people at the top table who are kind of making calls about what should and should not be researched, kind of trying to highlight the multiple dangers in just collecting data about a problem. I like your idea about shifting the focus so that we actually think about how do we measure and evaluate an institution rather than kind of collecting data about individuals. I think for me, my work has been kind of trying to just expose some of these hidden harms, particularly with quantitative data. I think expose things which are sold to us as inclusive. So doing a big data study on LGBTQ lives is maybe presented as something that is branded as a diversity and inclusion piece of work, when actually there are some kind of hidden dangers within that. So I think trying to kind of push back and be that slightly controversial voice in the room sometimes who goes, actually, just doing diversity and inclusion work isn't always an intrinsic good. So I think pushing back against that.
Yeah.
So I think for me, that's been my approach in my work, particularly with universities. I hope it's changed some hearts and minds, but I think it's a long journey that we have to go on about not only are we trying to reconfigure what is quantitative data or how are these kind of, what are the hidden harms of data, we're also kind of challenging some deep assumptions about equality, diversity, and inclusion work as well.
Thank you. That answer is so helpful for me, especially your experience with the post-secondary world, and just couldn't agree more that collecting this type of data is often very important for equity, and it's also one of the most efficient, effective ways to double down on stuff like marginalization and oppression. We have a lot of people now with comments and raised hands, so let's go to Mish. Go ahead. We can't hear you if you're talking. We can see that you're unmuted, but we can't hear you. Oh no. I think this is the same problem we had last week. So Mish, we're going to pause you and we're going to go to the data team.
Hi there, can you hear me okay?
Oh, now
Perfect.
I can. Is that you,
Yes.
Mish?
No, this is data team.
Oh, okay, great.
Great. So Kevin, thanks for sharing. I think your point about repeatedly demanding data that we may or may not do something with is well taken. But what about, I think when it comes to, in my experience, when it comes to LGBT data, a much more common case is that it's not a repeated demand, it's actually never asked. So we have no baseline. We don't have any data about LGBT residents. And so what I'd be looking for is actually like thinking about, I'm really excited about collecting that data and having that baseline. And as someone who is LGBT myself, I'm always waiting. I want to be counted, and I feel that I'm undercounted, actually. Can you speak to that?
A fantastic point, and something I should have maybe caveated a bit more in my kind of opening remarks. So my work mainly is kind of taking place in Scotland and the UK, and I would say that within that geographical context, we are, I would say, an international trailblazer in terms of the amount of data collected about LGBTQ communities. I've also had the kind of good fortune to be able to share this work in other parts of the world, where the idea of collecting any data about people who identify as LGBTQ seems like a distant kind of dream. And I think for me, trying to figure out where there's a need to collect, as you're mentioning, that kind of baseline data, that sense of filling those gaps, filling those absences, when that process starts, do we then know, or when are we then able to say we have enough data and we can stop collecting data and move on to addressing the kind of the findings that are being kind of coming from that? I think that's going to be a challenge. I think in terms of once data is being collected, knowing when is fine. But it was also something in my own work I've struggled with, if I'm being honest. So with the census in Scotland, I was very much in the camp that this was the first time these questions have been asked. This is the first time we'll have a kind of national picture of the UK's LGBTQ population. I was in the camp of let's get involved, let's get engaged, let's contribute to this data collection exercise and see how that data is being used. And I think in 10 years' time, when the next census takes place, if the government, if the census organizations haven't used that data meaningfully, I'm not going to be in the enthusiastic kind of get out the vote camp. I'm going to be more in the kind of critical side, thinking, what are the benefits, what are the dangers, what are the risks? So I think there's always that back and forth between knowing when do we need enough evidence, and then when do we have enough evidence to then take this to people in positions of power to actually do something about it. So thank you for kind of sharing where you are on that journey. And I think it's definitely more complex, I guess, across different geographies and different industries and sectors as well.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I think that's a really thoughtful answer. And one of the things that quantitative data is never going to have, if we're trying to use it in a nuanced way for equity, is a simple cut and dry answer, a simple, we should always do this, we should never do this. Like the idea that there's a list of rules because it's quantitative data doesn't really exist. And so I think that you're right, that it's going to have to be context by context. And in your book, you talk a lot about how important power dynamics are to equity, that it's who gets to decide when we have enough data or when people are using our data effectively enough that will contribute another round. Sorry, I cut you off. Go ahead.
No, kind of what you were saying there brought to mind some work I've been doing in the past few months around hate crime data in the UK. So this has been a kind of growing topic of interest around the collection of data on LGBTQ hate crimes. But again, kind of with this quantitative data, it's sometimes hard to figure out what the data is actually telling us. So when the numbers are going up, is that because we have better reporting tools? Is it because communities feel more confident in the police and the reporting agencies? Or actually are the incident rates of hate crimes increasing and increasing? And we've seen a kind of opposite effect with the kind of right-wing conservative government in the UK, where the kind of decrease in LGBT hate crime can be sold or presented in a way where the problem is getting better. But again, we can't tell, because is it the kind of the indicator, or is it the thing the indicator is representing? And I think all of that is kind of embedded with power, with politics, and with, as you're mentioning, who's in control of making decisions about what counts and what doesn't.
That's such a good example. Boy, I have so many follow-up questions on that, but instead of monopolizing all the time, I will, I think, Mish, we have sound now, and then we'll get to you, Leslie. I see your hand. Mish. No.
Unfortunately.
Oh, no. They thought that it was fixed. Okay, go ahead, Leslie. Let's turn it over to you. Oh no. Leslie? No. All right. So we're gonna go to the chat questions because we've lost Leslie as well. Do you want to, let's get to the question that was asked beforehand about so let me get this right. I'm going to read this so I get this right. The American Community Survey, that's a big national level data collection activity that happens in the US. And they are currently doing a comment period, which is really similar to what we all went through around the questions about race, and where like anybody from the public could put in comments about what they need for race, what they like, what do they want these questions to look like, what are the pros and cons. And the question is, given that Kevin has written extensively on census data collection, if possible, it would be great if you could ask Kevin to consider sharing his opinion and critique of the currently proposed question set for the American Community Survey. I've attached the Federal Register public call for public comment. Those of us deep in the queer data space are kind of scrambling to come together and discuss this proposal. And I think that I have a link to that, which I will put into the chat because it was attached as a PDF. But Kevin, I was wondering if you had any ideas about that.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you for the question. And I was able to take a look before our conversation today. And I think for me, there's one kind of larger kind of theme that jumped out from the proposal. And it wasn't around the sexual orientation part of the kind of proposal. It was more around the kind of capture of data on the trans community. So this is where we've seen quite a lot of differences in how this type of question is being formulated, is being asked. As I mentioned in my kind of opening notes, even within the UK, there were 2 different questions asked about the trans population. In England and Wales, the question was around gender identity, and was a kind of slightly confusing formation of whether or not the question asked whether your current gender was the same as your sex as registered at birth. Whereas in Scotland, and I'm a big champion of the Scottish approach, the Scottish question was a more plain, do you identify as somebody who is trans or as someone with a trans history? I know the proposal in the US Community Survey is, again, a little bit different. And from memory, I think what they're proposing is something that we often describe as a 2-step approach question. So this is where one question is asked about your sex at birth, and then a second question is asked about your current gender. These 2 pieces of data are then kind of linked up. And if there's a discrepancy, that kind of group are then identified as trans. I am not a fan of that type of question for a few different reasons. In terms of the question, it's kind of getting at what it's asking by kind of in a roundabout way by having these 2 data points. Also within the context of the UK, a question about your sex kind of assigned or registered at birth is often quite problematic for a few different reasons. In terms of if it's a question around, I don't know, your current experience of housing or healthcare or education, asking about the sex you were at birth doesn't tell us a huge amount about that sometimes. So again, it's like kind of a strange way of trying to identify the size of the trans population by kind of an indirect route. I know the 2-step question is particularly popular in North America. So again, these are quite kind of cultural, geographical differences between what we see in the UK and the US and Canada. But that would be my main feedback, is kind of pushing back against that 2-step question and maybe looking at the approach in Scotland and how the kind of testing of the trans question is a more direct, more clear way of asking whether or not somebody identifies as trans.
Thank you so much. That, as I'm already getting a flood of messages about how helpful that is, and how there really is a kind of there is strong guidance, especially in the US, about this 2-step question. And However, the kind of grassroots lived experience is quite different. And that's really hard that there's such a divide. And now we see or not the census, but something that's very close to the census, the American, is it the American Community Survey? So yeah, that is essentially the census. Sets the standard for a lot of what's done, but it moves so much more slowly and more conservatively for political reasons than the
It surprises me
ground.
when I do work. Yeah, when I do work with colleagues in the US around the kind of how normalized a two-step question is, whereas in the context of the UK, it would be very odd to ask somebody about their sex assigned at birth in a university application, or this. I mean, for trans people who have legally changed their gender will have a birth certificate and a new sex, again being asked a question which doesn't reflect that in the context of the UK would seem quite strange. So for me, I often am surprised how common a two-step question is in North America.
I'm going to ask one more question that's coming in from the chat before I turn it over to the raised hands, because it's directly a follow-up to this. A few people have put in, do you think that a sex assigned at birth question can be justified in a medical context, which of course the American Community Survey is not?
I think for all these questions, it depends on the context. I think there are some areas of research, some areas of policy, some areas of practice that should be asking questions about specific to whether it's kind of health, medical matters. I'm trying to think what medical matters we need to know your sex assigned at birth. I'm sure there's some. So I think, yes, definitely in some medical health context, that question would be a valid question. My work is mainly in social research, and across most areas of my work, whether it's education, housing, around kind of, if you also work with arts and cultural sectors, a question about your sex at birth, we didn't really kind of get at the answer we're looking at. So it'll always depend on the area of research that you're working in. But I would say in most of my work, in most kind of social research context, I can't see how that question will really provide an answer to what we're trying to investigate.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does get back to that first question, which is, what is it that you're actually trying to understand? Yeah. And without a very crystal clear understanding of that, we're never going to be able to find a way to get that, because you don't know, it's like shooting an arrow into the night with no goal. Okay. Oak, go ahead and unmute. Thanks for waiting.
Thank you. Kevin, Guyan, I am one of the people who recommended you, and I love your book. So thank you for coming. This is really nice. And all your comments. I am the one leading a group on trying to discuss turning in comments for this ACS SOGI question set test. So I agree what you're saying about sex assigned at birth. That's a problem all over the place. I always advocate for it not being included. People say they're gathering information on sexual orientation and gender identity, and then they add sex assigned at birth. And I'm like, this is not what you said you're collecting. It's a different data point. But so I, for my regular job, work on the Behavior Risk Factor Surveillance System Survey, which is a big deal in the United States for a health survey. It asks a lot of questions and is used all over the place. And for us, where the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, moves very slow, but we're advocating for, yeah, they have problems with sex assigned at birth and SOGI questions. The reason why behind they think they have to collect sex assigned at birth is because we have questions about cervical cancer screening rates. Have you ever been had a cervical cancer screening, et cetera, or prostate, or it's just all anatomical. So it all comes from Puritanism, we think, because why can't you just have an introduction in a section saying some of this may be applicable to you, some of it may not. This are questions about chronic disease screening, and say, do you have a prostate? And have the other questions if they say yes, and somehow there's an assumption that that's really offensive to say, but there hasn't been any tests to do that rather than ask sex assigned at birth. So that's just a comment of I do see even like more radical recommendations altogether with SOGI that they're saying sex assigned at birth needs to be asked in the medical context for direct services, but ultimately all over the place, I think moving to the actual anatomy, includes intersex people and the rest. So just wondering, that's more of a big comment, but I'm thinking you probably agree, but I'm wondering if there has been any discussion over in your area about actually the anatomy. I know you don't work in the health context of data collection as much, but it's food for thought as well.
Thank you. I think for me, it was just really helpful for you to set the scene, to say more about your work in the US and a kind of a health context. And for me, it's not my main area of kind of data work. It's more kind of in the social space or social research space. But for me, it's always interesting to think, and going back to what Heather kind of mentioned earlier about, we need to ask the questions that are going to return the information that we're interested in investigating. And there's no golden rule to doing that. Sometimes the questions we ask about gender, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, there's no kind of one-stop easy answer, and it always depends on the kind of topic under investigation. When I first started doing talks around the book, the question I probably got asked the most was, what's your kind of guidance on how to write the perfect sexual orientation question or the perfect gender identity question? And there's really no perfect way of doing it. And this is even within one kind of geographical context. I've had the fortune to do some work with kind of global international companies who are trying to design employer diversity monitoring forms for staff teams, which are based all around the world, operating in multiple languages, multiple cultural, social differences, where gender, sex, sexuality, race, disability, all of these concepts can mean different things in different places. So there's no kind of, one universal way of doing it. So thank you, Oak, for your kind of comments on that.
Thank you so much. Okay, I think we have Mish now on the phone.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Mish.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm hoping this gets worked out with my new earbuds, but I want to again say, because you couldn't hear me before, how much I appreciated your approach. And so I'm going to loop back to something both you and Heather said. And I wanted to ask kind of a granular question when I get there, but the intention of the information, but the context. So the context, if I'm understanding this correctly, is, are we moving equity forward when we gather information, in particular the data, and we strip it of its context? And Heather's framing of, we should be looking at the structure. And what I found fascinating, because you used Black women as your baseline to start your presentation, and I am racialized as Black, even though I'm Creole, and use Black women as an indicator population. And queer Black women, or queer Black folks, but in particular queer Black women, are a particularly good, sorry, I'm in New York, so you're going to hear background noise. You're going to see things. And I want to use an example because it kind of connects what you talked about with intersectionality, but also how it works in the system and why there is a danger when we add other variables and we try to apply that small n across an entire population. So in the US, we have Stonewall that we celebrate. And if you look at the pictures and the every year, kind of the pictures from Stonewall, how it's celebrated as someone who grew up in San Francisco at the height of the AIDS crisis. It's when I came of age, very much involved in the community. It's very homogenous and it's whitewashed. And it doesn't really, and there's a little bit that's sometimes brought up in some venues about the queer women color, technically they would be trans, I think is what they would be now, but in my day it was queer, who were actually the impetus for that, that movement kicking off in such a way. And so I'm going back to the data and how we've kind of stripped it over time of the context, the struggle within which that was created. And as we gather more and more data, I have seen over time, over 40 years, the safety of a population become less and less secure with the increase of, and I have shutter quotes, of inclusion with data. And so my understanding of your approach, I really, really like it, and I don't think there will be enough time today, and you don't have to answer this now. In the work that I do and I talk about when I say I don't believe in DEI, which is very sacrilegious here in the United States, I think it's very harmful how we approach it. What are some of your thoughts on how we might think about the data as opposed to trying to get more data so that we can see and get more information about what we know, of maybe translating that into how can we use that small n or that data to inform us about what we're missing, in particular ways to contextualize it that don't harm the community that we're actually trying to help and serve. It's a very big question, I know, but I'm so excited about what you had to say, and maybe Heather will join us, via email after this, but it's rare to see such a nuanced approach and handled so appropriately, delving into a subject that is just rife with little, barbs. So thank you so much for taking my comments and questions.
No, thank you, and thank you for persevering. I'm really glad you were able to speak. I'm realizing as well that actually what we've kind of covered so many themes, so many different paths in what is quite a short period of time, and even covering something as massively important a topic of intersectionality in about 60 seconds was definitely doing it an injustice. But the point you raised there about how these kind of larger categories can mask a lot of stuff that's happening under the surface. And I'm writing my second book at the moment, and there's one chapter in that book around the classification practices around LGBTQ people working in film and TV. And one of my kind of examples is looking at some of the data that the BBC in the UK collects around its staff. And for me, it's really kind of exposed some of the real hidden dangers that come with this kind of lumping of larger kind of aggregated categories. So within the context of the UK, of the BBC, when they look at their staff diversity data, there's actually an overrepresentation of LGBTQ people working at the BBC. But when we look at the kind of the breakdown of who's overrepresented in that LGBTQ categories, it's predominantly cisgender gay men. A huge underrepresentation of lesbians, a huge underrepresentation of trans staff. But again, in terms of this kind of equality and diversity metrics, the BBC could take that off its list of kind of job done, key performance indicator achieved, LGBTQ inclusion is satisfied. But actually, who's really losing out in this kind of misuse of data are parts of the LGBTQ community who aren't being meaningfully recognized and represented. So there's a real danger kind of hidden in those kind of lumping approaches. So one of my ambitions is to try as far as possible, as you kind of mentioned with your question, break down these larger groups, show those smaller n numbers, see actually who is being counted and who's not, and how these kind of data techniques can actually be masking quite a lot. And in some situations, if the data say showed an overrepresentation of LGBTQ community, possibly doing some dangers, because that might cut funding, cut resources, say actually there's no need to invest in these communities because inclusion and diversity is satisfied. So data can do a lot in different ways. And I think your example of those kind of intersectional, the kind of disaggregated elements is really important. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much. We are going to get to David as our last question, and thank you so much for your patience.
Of course. Can you all hear me?
We
Yes.
can.
Okay, great. I will try to keep this brief, but I am a rambler, so be warned. So I work for a state that collects student data, and we have data about whether a student is non-binary or whether they identify as male or female. And that data is, I think, legislatively mandated to be collected, maybe in a certain way. I'm not sure. But regardless, your very important point about what data to collect and prioritizing resources for other things is not what I'm asking about here. Now that we have this data, we as a state are running into all sorts of issues about what to do with it. Because right now we essentially report the existence of these kids, and you can see it by school or by district, whatever, which is already potentially identifying. But I've been working with a group of folks at the district who really want to make more intersectional data publicly available. And researchers can request this as well, with confidentiality issues or confidentiality agreements. But my real question is, how can we ensure that once the data has been collected, it's kind of building off what Mish was saying in a way. How can we make sure that we use this data to actually advance equity in a way that also respects student privacy, doesn't, reveal any PII, and is actually going to be for the benefit of these students? It's a very specific question for my specific context.
Thank you, David. Really big challenge, a real common challenge, I think, across many different industries, sectors, many different types of data projects. How do we meaningfully represent what can be numerically quite small communities, particularly when we're kind of keen to adopt an intersectional data lens? In some situations, it's going to be a case that the numbers are just too small in terms of the risk of revealing individuals, and I'm sure that's the last thing any of us want to do with data that might be quite sensitive. So for me, there's often a thinking, how can we kind of maybe bring together different types of data? So I'm a big fan of kind of, with the point of working with the quant data, can we bring in some testimonies, some kind of qualitative material to kind of show that these communities exist, but we can't maybe represent the kind of the count in the kind of visuals. I also found, for me, my thinking in this space was really helped by the work of Catherine Ghignazio and Lauren F. Klein in their book, Data Feminism. They have a fantastic chapter around data visualization and how we present data and how we present gaps and absences. And I think for me, thinking through, how do we visually show who's not being counted? How in the work that we do we show where, even if a community is too small to have the actual number on the bar chart, how do we meaningfully include and recognize the existence of this community in the work that we do? So in terms of kind of recommended reading, I would say take a look at that chapter of Data Feminism if you haven't had a chance to do so. I think gives some, for me, it was really helpful in thinking through that quite common challenge about working with smaller numbers.
Thank you so much.
Great question. Thank you so much for your patience while we got to you and all the rest of the in-person question and commenters today. And Kevin, I really, really appreciate you joining us today and spending, like I said, your Friday night with us. It really means the world. And as you can see, everyone in the chat is extremely grateful for you joining and you sharing your deep thinking and your insights around a tricky topic. We talk about it and think about it a lot, and the new insight and practical approach that you bring is extremely valuable.
Thank you so much, Heather, for the invite, and just a fantastic way to spend my evening. And thank you for sharing kind of examples from your work. And yeah, best of luck. It's, for me, this is really important work that we're all doing, and there's no kind of right or wrong answers. And hopefully my kind of talk this evening has presented some tips, ideas, suggestions on how we kind of navigate these challenges together.
It absolutely has, for sure. All right, so we need to wrap it up there, so everybody has time to take care of themselves before they do whatever's next, whether it's your weekend or whether this is your lunch break or your morning. We will be back next Friday, same time, same Zoom link, and I hope to see you all there. Take really, really good care of yourselves and really good care of each other.
Bye, everyone.
See you next Friday. Bye, everybody.